I'm a very big friend of what you guys do up here. Of course, I would say that. Everybody who comes here says that, but no, I think that I am. And I'm going to introduce something, a new player in the game of medicinal cannabis, the Australian Medicinal Cannabis Observatory. So that's me. That's our little logo, which some of you will recognize. I have some letters. I work actually in the environment of the emergency department out of the Australian National University and the University of Canberra. And one of the reasons I like coming up here is because I like to mingle with dangerous folk. And certainly within my realm, you guys are terribly dangerous people. You use drugs and shit. So all of my friends back home are sort of like, oh my God, you're going to be sort of, a revolutionary by the time you come home. I guess it probably takes one to know one. I have been, particularly by this mob in New South Wales, the Cannabis Initiative or whoever, I've been described as very dangerous because of what I regard as fairly mainstream ideas, but what they regard as fairly radical. So I'm in fact far more dangerous than you are in the first instance, and it's actually converted into a family thing. So if any of you are cops and you have me killed this evening, I've got another one to stand in place back home. So I've always been attracted to dangerous folk from all sorts of backgrounds. And I guess the reason being is because they lead thought on things. The most dangerous people, they're always clever, they're compelling, and they're charismatic. And that's why I like coming here, because you're unduly represented in your dangerousness, if this was the definition. I myself don't regard myself as particularly dangerous. I regard myself as rather disruptive. That used to be a bad word. I was very disruptive in school. And now all of a sudden I discover it's a good thing to be. So what I like to think that we do is disrupt the sort of normal paradigms of how we approach drugs. And I guess I should probably talk to you about how this idea of an Australian Medicinal Cannabis Observatory came about. And what better place to start than at the very beginning. Obviously, all of this starts with an Irishman. Everything starts with an Irishman. William Brooke O'Shaughnessy is the gentleman who translated a lot of what we know from the sort of cultural use of cannabis from a medicinal perspective in India into a palatable form for the medical profession back home. And he was quite the Renaissance man, involved in a whole bunch of different things, like myself, and so I have a natural affinity for him. He was said to have treated Queen Victoria's dysmenorrhea with a tincture of cannabis, but I've not been able to find any evidence for that whatsoever anywhere. With regards to the beginnings of our particular voyage, I guess it starts with this young man, a young man called Dan Haslam, who I never had the pleasure to meet. I spoke on the phone several times to him, and we chatted about what he thought was important and what should be done in Australia. And then I have almost weekly been harassed and intimidated and scared by his mum, a lady called Lucy Haslam, who is one of the most fearsome creatures I have ever had the pleasure of knowing. And I just do what she says because I'm scared of doing otherwise. Our beliefs and where we're coming from as far as the observatory is concerned are very straightforward, and I hope that they're similar to your own. They start with the fact that our approach to medicinal cannabis over the last century has been just factually incorrect. It's just been wrong. And that's for a whole bunch of different reasons we could argy-bargy about, but it's been incorrect. We're now overdue for that correction. And in the course of correcting those lack of facts, we probably need to separate recreational and medicinal cannabis. There are opponents to a regulated medicinal cannabis market from both sides of the debate. So from people who don't think it should be there in the first place, and from people who actually don't think it should be regulated. I'm in the middle between the two. We oppose virulently big green, so the idea of people making a great deal of profit out of other people's suffering, and very strongly support the concept of people, or as I'm a doctor, patients before profits. And we'll commit or collaborate with anyone who is committed to this concept of open science. so that the science is done not for the purposes of supporting profit, not for the purposes of supporting big pharma, but for the purposes of getting knowledge that other people can use. And so the question we always ask with all of the work that we do in the observatory is, does everything we do pass the test? What test is that? Well, we call it Dan's test, but it could be any of your kids' tests. It could be anybody who is using medicinal cannabis in any circumstance. Is what we are doing likely to benefit someone who was in Dan's position? I don't know if you know the story of Dan Haslam. Dan died from cancer very tragically early, and he found great relief from using cannabis. And if what is being done isn't actually benefiting a patient directly, then it's not good enough for us. So I'm here to tell you about something new, another dangerous idea. I tend to churn them out. And I like to think of it as our dangerous idea because it's been done in conjunction with a lot of people from the cannabis consuming community, because that's where the knowledge is in Australia. It's not with me, it's with you lot. And that's us. That's our Australian Medicinal Cannabis Observatory logo. Soon to be on T-shirts everywhere and available at no price whatsoever. We established this 2 years ago in the knowledge that medicinal cannabis was in fact going to be an inevitability in Australia. There was absolutely no way that it wasn't going to take off, particularly with Lucy Haslam harassing politicians about it. We also did it recognizing that there was absolutely no preparation for a medical cannabis market and no infrastructure to support it. And in Canberra, we're in a very good position to negotiate and discuss policy with key players. And so this is where we've been working from. We've kind of decided deliberately to avoid the clinical trial space. It's very messy. It's very controversial. It is firmly ensconced and embedded and intertwined with big pharmacy, and we don't like that. So we've left that to other people who are perhaps more comfortable sleeping with those bedfellows. And so our goals within this observatory is to engage Australian consumers and to learn from their experiences. So this is very much a feedback and to try to incorporate your knowledge into medical knowledge for a greater benefit for an Australian population. We want to create a safe and trusted registry of users. So this is a registry that is not available to pharmaceutical companies, not a commercial registry, but something much more like the Australian Household Survey, which is held in the ANU's Australian Data Archive and is encrypted to all bejesus and is only available to those people who are conducting the research. We're very interested in facilitating the receipt, analysis, and feedback of the contents of the samples. This is a much broader ambition than the Pelican study. I mean, obviously, imitation is tremendously flattering. Our ambition is substantially greater than merely one subsection of the population. We are able to do this now, and I'll show you how that happens. And finally, to provide an independent Australian education program for people who can administer the medicinal form of cannabis. It has to be independent because if you have big pharmacy involved in the education process, they're going to clearly educate prescribers about the benefits of prescribing their product. So it really needs to be independent and academic. So to that end, a survey. We heard about surveys, and once again, I'm flattered that the Lambert Initiative was able to put together a survey in such short notice. Ours was designed over the last 18 months, and we deliberately chose today to launch it because we think you are very important. And it's from your group of people that we want to hear. It's for the consumer, involving the consumer, and it's by the consumer. The questions that are on it are questions that have been suggested to us by you, and we are just brokering it. It is not market research. I'll repeat that. It is not market research. There are many surveys available in Australia. Ours is not market research. And it's reiterative. So we'll be coming back to you again and talking to you again about what the implications of the answers you've given us. This survey will serve to inform our registry, and we're very lucky in that Dr. Tony Mackay, actually Professor Tony Mackay, the previous Dean of Social Sciences, is one of our key collaborators. I'd emphasize that all of the people who are involved in this research in the observatory provide their services pro bono. We are not paying any of our researchers for what they do, which keeps them honest. It's independent of industry, and it's an opportunity for consultation. We firmly believe in open science. There are no confidentiality clauses when we sign up our collaborators. We believe that de-identified, the data should be available to any researcher. We think that a monopoly in research in Australia is a very foolish idea because monopolies, like all monopolies, are open to abuse. What is useful about the collaboration in the ANU is that we have the ability to tie the survey and the data from the survey to an analytical process. So if you're using a substance, and this is like Nick's Pelican study, but much broader in scope. It's not just pediatric epilepsy, it's anything. If there is something that you're using medicinal cannabis for, we can test your product and tell you what's in it, and we will be happy to do so. We have the very best of analytical expertise in the country, based out of the Research School of Chemistry at the ANU, and there is no better group of forensic chemists in Australia, or analytical chemists. So you will have the opportunity to submit your medical samples for whatever condition that you're using for analysis. And that will help us sort out the wheat from the chaff in terms of providing our research colleagues in the clinical world information about what is active and what is not. We're very determined that we should have an Australian education system for an Australian provider. There are many education systems out there. We are quite restricted, you will all understand this, in Australia, about what we can use cannabis for. At the moment, next to nothing. What we will be able to use it for, initially, still next to nothing. But I see that as moving forward and developing. But we need to have, we aren't going to be able to import an American system, for example, of education into Australia and have that palatable for the people who are going to be passing laws. I think the other thing is that the experience of medical cannabis in Australia is substantially different to those other countries elsewhere that are introducing it. And so Australia actually deserves to have its own education system. The idea is that this would be both APRA, the Association of Healthcare Professionals, their registry, and a medical college accredited. It would be online and updated and current, updated with the help of people who are in this room at the moment, people who will know a great deal more about developments in the field than people like myself. And two modules, or two types of modules involved, a basic module and clinical modules. The basic modules include social history of medicinal cannabis in Australia, a review of the endocannabinoid system, a review of the cannabis plant, the pharmacology of cannabis and cannabinoids, and delivery and dosage of cannabis medicine. The last one perhaps being the most challenging for medical practitioners or APRA registered practitioners in Australia. Many of the people in this room know a great deal about all of this. The problem is that many medical folk don't. And this gives them the opportunity to be reassured that it's going to be okay. There is a corpus of knowledge out there which is available to them should they want to learn about it. You've got to understand that in Australia there will be clinicians who will not be interested in getting involved in this because it's naughty and dangerous, and that's fine. They shouldn't be forced to. But for those who want to be involved in this, they're going to feel greatly reassured if there's something that's endorsed not only by their registration body, but also by the colleges that train them. The first element will be open to everybody, because I think it's really important that the general public understands that, in fact, the business of medicinal cannabis and where we've got to now is a farce. It's something that should never been arrived at. And only by exposing how we got to that position will we be able to reassure the people in the middle, the general public, who have no interest in its use, but who may actually end up opposing this because they don't know enough about it. The clinical modules are limited to start with because we think that this is where we are going to get buy-in in terms of the colleges and APRA. This allows us in the meantime to develop data which will permit us to design and deliver wider subjects and pathologies. And I think that this is only the beginning. So we're talking about cancer and palliative care, seizure and severe intractable seizure disorders, and refractory pain. And I think it's far more important to get something on the board than it is to get everything on the board. We've seen the fact what happened in California, where the Californians introduced legislation that was very broad indeed. And in fact, what they successfully did was inoculate their population against that legislation. So what we need to see is a narrow introduction for education with a view to opening it up as soon and as quickly as people who are as nerdy as me are reassured that it's safe. Obviously, it's important that we acknowledge that there are cannabis use disorders, and there are special groups of users, like what about pregnancy? What about young people? There will be an entire section on that. These are dangerous times right now in this field for a number of different reasons. I think the biggest reason why we are at a hazardous point is because of the sheer amount of money that's involved. There are people out there who want a bit of that buck. You are beautiful women wearing a chastity belt to which you only have the key, and you are potentially about to hand over the key to people who could end up being big pharma and take you for everything that you've got. It's the only thing that you have is this knowledge. And I would say to you, be very careful about who you decide to collaborate with in this space. There are a lot of people who are claiming to be on your side at the moment. I don't know if you've been approached as a community. I certainly know that there are, in all of the various meetings that we go to at Canberra and at state level, there are increasing numbers of people from the big end of town who want a bite of this market. And I would be very cautious about who you get into bed with. There are challenges ahead, and I don't want to interfere with the combi parade, so I'm just going to sort of push on through these. And I see these largely in the spaces of opposition to medical cannabis, although I think that's actually beginning to wane in Australia. Perhaps one of the greatest ones is exploitation of the field at the moment. Impatience, which we'll talk about, and legislation. There are three main groups of opponents, and one which is beginning to rear its head. Those who actually just don't know anything about it. They haven't read the literature, they're confused about the differences between recreational and medicinal cannabis. And that's simple, that's simply a matter of educating them, of informing them, and doing so gently. There are those who have a moral or political problem with drug use. So, moral problem, they think that it's wrong or it's nasty. A political problem, it's going to lose them votes. I think a lot of politicians have not so much a moral opposition to medicinal cannabis or any form of cannabis use. They have more of a political problem because they don't know how to sell it to their constituents. And I think, once again, we can help them with that. They perhaps don't understand or realize the extent of support that there is for this in the community, and it's very much our job to help point that out to them. I think one sinister group that I have a real problem with, and I'm not prepared to forgive, are those who are involved with companies that make opiates or other analgesics. We've seen quite clearly that some of the strongest opponents to medicinal cannabis in America are in fact on the boards of all of these companies. That's what I call, and what the medical profession calls, a conflict of interest. And that is one of the big problems with the medical profession in Australia. I think that there are certainly clinicians in Australia who are conflicted in this way. But since in the last 6 months, I would also say that I've identified a further group, which is very disappointing, but it's real. And though that is people from our own ranks, in our own space, who are in fact participating frequently covertly or in an occult fashion with big pharma. And they, for example, are people who would block the use of botanical products or try to pitch synthetic products that could be marketed at much higher value. And I think we've seen a lot of that in Australia in the last 6 months particularly. There are great researchers in Australia, people who I have in the past admired tremendously, and they've turned bad. And they have become avaricious, and they have sold their souls. Not in a way that is publicly known, but certainly in a way that is known when you get down to regulation, when you get down to the meetings when we see, for example, in New South Wales. So when you run a pharmaceutical trial, it's largely the pharmaceutical company that pays for the trial. And yet in New South Wales at the moment, there's a trial ongoing that is being paid for by New South Wales. So a pharmaceutical company is being paid by New South Wales to run a trial, which has been brokered by scientific colleagues. This is completely immoral, and nobody knows that. That's a conflict of interest. You try publishing that trial in any major journal and not get lambasted for it because you're conflicted. You sold your soul. I don't know. I saw her. I didn't catch her. She was here last year. For any of you who are interested, if you've seen this graphic novel of Weed Woman, it's brilliant. I love it. And the idea, it's an allegory. It's kind of like Paul Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress for the evolution of the cannabis market in general. But she has got her finger on the pulse. She warns us of the shape of things to come. And the shape of things to come is this: the PBPs, the people, or the prophets before people. I love graphically. I think they're stunning. They remind me of the nasty little boy in Sin City who carves up people. And morally, I think they're identical. She describes them as people who came and presented themselves as friends. Their darkness grew so powerful it brought others, and that darkness began to spread. This is happening. This is happening right now. And I don't mean to put a downer on any of this, because this is also a time of great excitement. But this is so obvious to people outside Australia that, in fact, there's only one country that's actually earned a graphic PBP. There's your Australian PBP. This is what the rest of the world is seeing as what is happening in the evolution of this market. So be careful. If you're not aware of this, please look into what's going on. So how do we identify people who might want to exploit what is your knowledge and what is the science? The question you need to ask yourselves is cui bono, which is Latin for who stands to gain. This is from Cicero, one of the greatest legislators in the history of debate and interrogation. Who stands to gain? How do we find out who stands to gain from this sort of research? Is the sole purpose of this research to make money? Who's making that money, and how are they making it? Is there a commitment to open science? Are people getting signed up to confidentiality clauses left, right, and center? What are they promising, and when will they deliver? What conditions do they demand of you? And what sort of conflicts of interest are involved? If any of these ring a bell, these are people who you should think long and hard about collaborating with. I'm not one to white ant other people's research. I am just warning you that this is out there. And if you look at the way, for example, how the alcohol lobby has free rein in this country, that is also how the cannabis lobby, unless it's policed by the group of consumers themselves, unless you guys take control of this, this is what's going to happen here as well. So what to do? How can you protect yourselves? Well, it's pretty straightforward, really, because you guys hold all the cards. Without your involvement, then there is no research. There's no collaboration. There's nothing that Big Pharma can do without you determining the terms. And you can take your ball and you can leave the playground. So it doesn't matter how fancy, it doesn't matter how sharp. If you feel that you're being exploited in any way, you probably are. And the information that's being generated from either whatever you're giving, either data or, for example, germline, that is going to end up with the Tilrays and the GWSs of the world, rather than in the hands of an Australian industry. So, what challenges are we faced with? The first I'd allude to is impatience, and I get that. There's great impatience among consumers. For myself included, I think a lot of this is already sold. I think a lot of the information is done. We're ready to go ahead. And yet, again and again and again, you find yourselves with blockades to your progress. And that's often not sinister. It's more hesitancy from people of my professional background, the hesitancy of nervous collaborators. And to both sides of this divide, I say, just in the same way as my kids do when they see Cinderella, have courage and be kind. Be gentle with each other while you negotiate this difficult period. Because there's no point in making enemies. There's a lot of people from both sides of that fence who are working towards a similar goal. And I say, try to do it together. Try not to drive your agenda, or I'll try not to drive mine. There have been huge bounds in legislation to date, largely driven by the consuming community. This certainly wasn't initiated by politicians, that's for sure. It's the consuming community who has driven this agenda in Australia. And the farm to pharmacy is well underway. Pharmacy to patient, not so much. And I suspect they're probably waiting for something as fancy as farm to pharmacy for it to develop. But yeah, there's a real hold-up in actually getting from growing a product to getting it into a patient. And so we're working hard on that at the moment. I would argue that there is no real compassionate access scheme in place in Australia. There are a lot that are, once again, marketed or portrayed as such, but I think those portrayals are flawed. If you look at, say, for example, the tick system, I think, for starters, the nomenclature sucks. Compassionate access has got to be more than just for a terminal illness. There's very limited eligibilities. It's under the rubric of justice and not health, which is just dim. And it's also dependent upon police discretion. The quantities that are allowable clearly confound recreational and medicinal requirements. And once again, behind closed doors, I have heard researchers in this field argue against a decent compassionate access system because it could interfere with their trials. I don't care. That's the whole point of a compassionate access system, is that it's compassionate. Work your way around that, buddy. It is not up to the general population to facilitate your research. There are issues of driving which I think are reasonably easy solved. So I might just, now if I can work this, I'm going to show you a little clip, just maybe to remind us of what this is really about.